What if the most famous headline of the 20th century was never written? What if, on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, the wire services never had to send out the 4 words that stopped the entire world where it stood? What if John F. Kennedy walked out of Parkland Memorial Hospital that day instead of being carried out of it? Here's the thing people forget about that afternoon in Dallas, because the ending is so total that it swallows everything that came before it. We treat it like it was inevitable, like fate had already written the last page before the motorcade even left Love Field. It wasn't. The margin between the president living and dying that day was somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds, and depending on which historian you ask, it might have been even less than that. This wasn't destiny, it was a startlingly close call that happened to go the wrong way. So let's walk through what actually happened first, because the accurate version is stranger and more fragile than the myth. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy landed in Dallas as part of a political trip through Texas, meant to shore up support ahead of the 1964 election, smoothing over a real rift between the liberal and conservative wings of the state's Democratic Party. The route through downtown Dallas had been published in the local papers days in advance, standard practice for a presidential visit. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, the motorcade turned off Main Street onto Houston Street and then had to make a sharp left turn onto Elm Street, a dogleg turn so tight it forced the Lincoln convertible carrying the president down to a crawl, somewhere around 11 miles an hour, directly beneath the windows of the Texas School Book Depository. Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee of the depository, was positioned at a 6th-floor window with a mail-order rifle. He fired 3 shots in roughly 8.5 seconds. The first apparently missed. The second struck Kennedy in the upper back and exited his throat, a wound that on its own, according to the trauma surgeons who later treated him, was not necessarily fatal. It also struck Texas Governor John Connally, riding in the same car, who was hit in the back, wrist and thigh and survived. It was the 3rd shot, striking Kennedy in the head roughly 5 to 8 seconds after the first, that killed him. He was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1 o'clock that afternoon. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One less than 2 hours later, standing beside Jacqueline Kennedy, still in a suit stained with her husband's blood, because she refused to change out of it, telling people she wanted the country to see what they had done. Between that 2nd shot and that 3rd shot sits the entire hinge of this story, and it's worth sitting with exactly how narrow it actually was. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, riding on the running board of the follow-up car directly behind the president's limousine, heard the first shot and immediately began moving forward, on foot, toward the presidential car. He would later testify that if the driver of Kennedy's limousine, Secret Service agent Bill Greer, had accelerated the instant the first shot rang out, instead of glancing back over his shoulder and only flooring the accelerator after the fatal headshot had already landed, Hill believes he could have reached the car in time to either shield Kennedy with his own body, or the extra few seconds of distance and speed might have been enough to spoil Oswald's final shot entirely. Hill has spent decades since publicly wrestling with those 2 or 3 seconds, convinced they were the difference between the country he grew up in and the one that actually happened. So here's our divergence point, and it's smaller than a change in venue or a cancelled trip. The car doesn't hesitate. Bill Greer's foot hits the accelerator the instant the first shot cracks. The limousine lurches forward out of the kill zone a beat sooner than it did, and Oswald's 3rd shot, the one that actually killed Kennedy in our timeline, goes wide, or clips the trunk, or misses entirely. Kennedy is still hit in the shoulder and throat by the 2nd shot. He survives it, badly wounded, rushed into surgery at Parkland alongside Governor Connally, but alive. Oswald is still captured that same afternoon after shooting Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit during his attempted escape exactly as he was historically, because that part of the day never depended on whether the third shot landed. Let's sit with what that actually changes, starting with the single biggest one. Lyndon Johnson never becomes president that day. He remains vice president, sidelined for the rest of Kennedy's term, the way vice presidents mostly were before the office picked up real institutional weight, and the man historians credit with actually pushing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through a reluctant Congress, using decades of personal relationships built during his years as Senate Majority Leader, simply isn't in the Oval Office to do it. Kennedy's own Civil Rights Bill, introduced in June 1963 after the confrontations in Birmingham, was stalled in committee at the time of the shooting, and most historians of the period agree it was Kennedy's death, and Johnson's blunt insistence that passing it was the only fitting monument to a murdered president that broke the legislative logjam. A surviving Kennedy, recovering from a near-fatal gunshot wound, but still fundamentally a cautious deal-maker with a much thinner relationship with Southern Committee chairman than Johnson had, likely gets a civil rights bill eventually, but probably later and probably weaker, without the emotional mandate and assassination created out of thin air. Vietnam is the second big fork, and it's genuinely the most argued over question among historians who study this exact scenario, so it's worth laying out honestly rather than picking a side. In October 1963, a month before Dallas, Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 American military advisors from Vietnam by the end of that year, and some of his closest aides later argued he was privately planning a broader drawdown after the 1964 election. Once withdrawal couldn't be used against him as a campaign weakness. Other historians push back hard on that reading, pointing out that Kennedy had also just as recently approved the coup that removed and killed South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem only 3 weeks earlier, deepening rather than lightening American involvement, and that Kennedy's own rhetoric throughout his presidency was every bit as committed to Cold War containment as Johnson's. There's no clean answer here. What we do know is that it was Johnson, not Kennedy, who presided over the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 and the enormous troop escalation that followed it, and a surviving Kennedy, whichever way he leaned, is the one making those specific calls instead, with a different temperament, a different relationship with his own generals, and a different set of political incentives heading into a 1964 re-election campaign he now gets to run as a wounded, sympathetic incumbent rather than watching his martyrdom hand Johnson an almost unbeatable landslide. There's a domestic political question sitting right underneath all of this, which is what a wounded, recovering Kennedy actually does with the 1964 election. Historically, Johnson ran that fall as a grieving nation's chosen continuity candidate against the Republican nominee Barry Goldwater, an outcome that turned into one of the largest landslides in American history, helped enormously by Goldwater's own hardline positioning and by the country's raw emotional need to affirm the man who had picked up Kennedy's fallen banner. A surviving Kennedy runs a completely different race. He's an incumbent again, but now a visibly wounded one, recovering from major surgery, facing the same Goldwater matchup, but without the tidal wave of national grief pulling voters toward him out of loyalty to a dead man. It's very likely Kennedy still wins, given Goldwater's struggles connecting with the broader electorate that year, but probably by a far narrower margin, a normal, contested, argued over election rather than the emotional coronation Johnson actually got. That narrower mandate matters because it means less political capital walking into a second term, less room to strong-arm Congress the way Johnson did with his landslide behind him, and a much more constrained window for exactly the kind of ambitious legislation on civil rights and everything else that Johnson's Great Society actually delivered. It's also worth pausing on Robert Kennedy, because his own political arc was so tightly bound to his brother's death that a surviving JFK reshapes it completely. Historically, Robert Kennedy served as his brother's Attorney General, one of the most trusted and combative figures in the administration. And it was only after the assassination and after a difficult stretch working under Johnson that he ran for the Senate from New York and then, in 1968, for president himself, a campaign that ended with his own assassination in Los Angeles that June. None of that specific sequence needs to unfold the same way if his brother is alive and still in the Oval Office. Robert Kennedy, in this scenario, likely stays exactly where he is, running the Justice Department, deeply involved in the civil rights fights of the mid-1960s, positioned as heir apparent to a political dynasty that hasn't yet been defined by tragedy, rather than a man who inherited his brother's unfinished mission out of grief and had to build his own campaign almost entirely on that inheritance. The Cold War, more broadly, bends in a gentler direction, and this part is on firmer ground. By late 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev had spent a year rebuilding a working relationship out of the wreckage of the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous October, a crisis that had brought both countries closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. In June 1963, Kennedy delivered a speech at American University explicitly calling for a re-examination of American attitudes toward the Soviet Union. And 2 months later, the two countries, along with the United Kingdom, signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the first arms control agreement of the entire nuclear age. A Kennedy who survives Dallas is a Kennedy heading into a second term with real momentum on détente, momentum that in our actual timeline stalled out and had to be rebuilt from scratch years later under Nixon. It's entirely plausible as surviving Kennedy accelerates arms control efforts that historically took most of another decade to arrive. Then there's the domestic culture of the thing, which might honestly be the strangest ripple of all. The Kennedy mythology as we know it, the Camelot framing, the golden, what might have been quality that turned a genuinely mixed first-term presidency into a national wound that never fully closed, exists specifically because Kennedy died suddenly, violently, and young at the peak of his public popularity before the ordinary grinding disappointments of a full two-term presidency could tarnish any of it. Jacqueline Kennedy gave the interview that coined the Camelot comparison a week after the funeral, explicitly framing his presidency in mythic terms while the country was still in shock. A surviving Kennedy doesn't get that treatment. He gets normal politics. He gets a contested 1964 campaign, a Vietnam policy that will draw real criticism no matter which direction he takes it, likely continued friction with Southern Democrats over civil rights, and eventually, by 1968 or whenever his final term ends, an approval rating that has almost certainly come back down to earth the way every president does. Camelot, as a cultural touchstone, probably never gets built at all because a Camelot was built out of grief. And there's a lot less grief in this version of the country. And then there's the conspiracy culture, which is worth dwelling on because it reshaped American trust in institutions for the rest of the century. In our actual timeline, Oswald was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby on November 24, 1963, on live television while being transferred between jails, which meant the one person who could have explained his motives in open court never got the chance to. The Warren Commission's 1964 investigation concluded Oswald acted alone, but the combination of a dead president, a dead suspect, and a rushed, imperfect government report produced exactly the conditions for 50 years of doubt, alternate theories, and a widening crack in public trust that arguably never fully healed. In this scenario, Oswald survives to be arrested, and crucially, Kennedy survives to be a witness, a victim, and eventually a source capable of describing what he remembered from inside that limousine. Whether or not Jack Ruby still tries to kill Oswald days later is genuinely an open question, since Ruby's stated motive was grief and rage over Kennedy specifically, and a living president might remove that motive entirely. If Oswald lives to stand trial, the country gets an actual courtroom, actual cross-examination, actual physical evidence, tested in an adversarial process instead of a government commission working largely behind closed doors. It's entirely possible that the specific flavor of institutional distrust that defined the back half of 20th century America, the sense that the official story is never the real story, simply doesn't calcify into the permanent fixture of American life it became, because the central event that seeded it never gets the chance to stay so unbearably unresolved. There's a media dimension to this too, and it might be the single biggest reason the real assassination hit the way it did. By 1963, roughly 9 out of 10 American households owned a television set, and the Kennedy shooting became one of the first genuinely synchronized national trauma events in history, with regular programming interrupted within minutes and CBS anchor Walter Cronkite delivering the confirmation of death live on air, visibly pausing to compose himself before continuing, a moment replayed so many times since that it's become its own piece of American cultural memory. Millions of people across the country experience the news at almost exactly the same moment, watching the same grainy footage, hearing the same halting announcement, in a way that simply hadn't been possible for any earlier presidential death, not Lincoln's, not McKinley's, not even Franklin Roosevelt's, less than 20 years earlier. That shared, simultaneous, televised grief is arguably what cemented the assassination so permanently into the national psyche, more than the act itself. Take away the death, and you take away that entire shared ritual of mourning. No interrupted broadcasts stretching into a somber 4-day weekend. No state funeral watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. No riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups walking behind the caisson down Pennsylvania Avenue. Television still would have carried the story of a president shot and wounded in Dallas breathlessly, urgently, but a recovery narrative resolves into relief rather than grief, and relief simply doesn't get replayed for 60 years the way grief does. There's a quieter thread worth pulling too, which is the space program. Kennedy's 1962 speech at Rice University, promising to put an American on the moon before the decade was out, became after his death an unofficial memorial project, something Johnson and NASA leaned on explicitly, invoking the fallen president's name to keep Congress funding an enormously expensive and politically vulnerable program through the rest of the 1960s. Apollo 11 landed in July 1969, 6 years after Kennedy set the goal, and the mission was widely covered at the time as a fulfillment of a dead man's promise. In this scenario, Kennedy might plausibly be sitting in the Oval Office, or recently out of it, when Neil Armstrong actually steps onto the lunar surface, watching his own specific challenge get answered in real time, instead of it becoming a posthumous tribute broadcast to a country that had spent 6 years missing him. And there's a longer historical shadow worth naming before we close this out, because assassination attempts on American presidents were not by 1963 some unthinkable rupture in the natural order. Lincoln was killed in 1865, Garfield in 1881, McKinley in 1901, and there had been serious near-miss attempts on Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 and on Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, before he'd even been sworn in, when a gunman firing at him instead fatally wounded Chicago's mayor standing beside him. Kennedy surviving Dallas doesn't erase that pattern, and it doesn't guarantee the story ends there either. Political violence has a long, ugly history in American life, both before and after 1963, and this scenario isn't a promise that danger stops finding presidents. It's simply one specific afternoon in one specific city tipping the other way. Zoom out far enough And here's what's genuinely strange about this whole scenario compared to most of these counterfactuals. Usually, the interesting question is what gets built in the vacuum left behind by the person who died. Here, the interesting question runs the other way. It's about what never gets built at all, because the vacuum itself never opens up. No great society passed on the strength of a martyr's name. No Vietnam escalation carried out by the specific man who actually carried it out. No Camelot myth softening the edges of a real, flawed, ordinary presidency into something closer to legend. No 50 years of a country quietly, permanently unsure whether it had ever really been told the truth about its own worst afternoon. Take away those 3 seconds in Dealey Plaza, and you don't just save one man's life. You take an entire nation's slow-burning wound and turn it back into something much smaller and much more survivable. A bad day in Texas that a president lived through instead of the day that a country never really got over. It's worth being honest too about what doesn't automatically get better just because Kennedy lives. A surviving Kennedy still has to govern through the same fractured segregationist wing of his own party, still has to manage the same overconfident generals pushing for deeper involvement in Southeast Asia, still has to navigate a Soviet leadership in Moscow that could turn hostile again at any moment despite the recent thaw. None of the underlying pressures that shaped the 1960s, the civil rights movement's demand for real federal action, the slow-building catastrophe in Vietnam, the ever-present danger of nuclear escalation simply evaporate because one bullet misses its mark. What changes is not the pressure itself, but who is sitting at the desk absorbing it, with what skills, what instincts, and what political capital, and historians who study this exact scenario tend to agree on very little, except that the decade that follows looks recognizably different in its details, while still being recognizably the same turbulent decade underneath. What I keep coming back to with this one is how physically small the actual hinge is, smaller even than Alfred's swamp or Caesar's unread letter. Not a battle, not a decision made over weeks. A driver's foot 2 or 3 seconds late on an accelerator pedal on a downhill street in Dallas, Texas at noon. Kennedy lives or he doesn't. And depending on which way those seconds tip, an entire generation either grows up haunted by a murder it never solved to its own satisfaction, or it grows up in the shadow of an ordinary, complicated, second-term president who happened to survive the worst afternoon of his life. The car never stopped moving that day. It just didn't move quite fast enough.